Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I make sense of what's happening in the news, technology, business, and beyond through the lens of economics. Let's jump right in.
First, let's briefly talk about the VP pick. I'm curious, it was just announced. I'm curious to hear your hot take. I'll share mine, which is I don't really understand it. I thought they were going to go with Shapiro for Pennsylvania, or maybe even Kelly. I think this, some people are saying maybe it's a sign of strength that Kamala can double down, but sort of on sort of progressivism. He seems like a rural progressive, almost like a professional, managerial class idea of what a working class person is, in the sense that he says a lot of sort of the progressive rhetoric that they do, but he does it in kind of a folksy demeanor. And he's sort of symbolic of what happened in Minnesota with sort of the riots and not doing enough to stop them during the summer of Floyd. So I don't really get how this helps them with sort of the working class base. I don't think we saw that in his gubernatorial sort of results, that he had any more sway with the working class than someone else would have. I'm curious how you think about this pick as it helps Kamala.
I don't know. I mean, betting markets gave Kamala a very slight bump after the selection, but I think that was probably just because she had a VP candidate. I think that it was, a standard intraday movement sized bump. So I don't think that betting markets I don't think it's really going to matter in the chances, or nobody expects it to matter. People in general, like people who bet in the betting markets, don't expect it to matter much to her overall chances of winning. Shapiro was from Pennsylvania, which is probably going to be a more competitive state than Minnesota. Like if Kamala's about to lose Minnesota, she's kind of fucked. But Pennsylvania will be a very competitive state, and Shapiro could have helped there. But also he's a younger guy. He's younger than her, right? And what we've seen with Trump and Vance is that when you pick a younger guy who's obviously like supposed to be the future, it can steal a little bit of the limelight. Like there's still a lot of attention on Vance right now because he's a younger guy than Trump. Trump's old. Kamala's not very old. She's like 60. Shapiro's like, I don't know, 54. It's not a big difference, right? I think Walz is like a year or 2 years older than Kamala. It's not a big difference, but he looks old. And, Shapiro, I think there would have been more attention on him as opposed to Kamala herself. Now, maybe, if Kamala were a unpopular, uncharismatic person, maybe that would be good. But I think that they're basically betting that Kamala has charisma now, that she's sort of changed. She seemed very uncharismatic and failed to catch fire in the 2020 primary. But they're betting that she's better now. Walz, it is Walz, right? Not Waltz. I think it's Walz. That's the problem when you read all news and you never watch TV news. TV's gone. Or you can watch YouTube, but those people just mispronounce everything. So then, like, Walz he's the guy who first unleashed the weird insult against Vance and against Trump, right? He gave this interview. He coined that, right? That wasn't Kamala herself. It was Walz. And so that's been a very effective sort of message, this sort of message of sunny normalcy. It's nobody's saying it yet, but it really is a Reagan 1984 style message. It's morning in America, why are you so weird kind of message. And the economic data, is good enough that it's actually better than 1984, honestly. And so it's good enough that it really pretty much justifies that. We'll talk about that later. But then the idea of running the sunny optimist campaign of return to normalcy, I think is a good thing. As for Walz's positions, he's voting wise. Like if you look at his voting, he's more moderate than most Democrats. Also with Shapiro, you'd be giving up a governorship, which is very valuable. But then with Walz, he's pretty moderate on his voting record. So Manchin is very happy with the Walz pick. Sanders is very happy with the Walz pick as well. So that's interestingly, you've united Manchin and Sanders. I think he's fine. He seems fine. He's pro-nuclear, very pro-nuclear. He is YIMBY. He's very much in terms of like housing stuff. I don't actually know. I know that there were riots in Minneapolis. I don't know what how he was connected to that at all. People, I guess, associate like, oh, it happened in your state. I mean, sure, okay, fine. I don't know about how many riots there were in Pennsylvania. Like, I didn't. All the the worst riots were in Minneapolis. Well, the worst riots are on the West Coast. The worst riots are in Portland and Seattle. But the there were riots in Minneapolis because that's where Floyd was, right? That's where he lived. So. Yeah, so I don't really know about that actually. I have to look that up, but we'll see. Yeah, so we don't know. We don't know yet. I'd say that he seems fine to me, and I don't think it's going to make a big difference. And I understand why it makes sense they picked him. He's like, there's basically two types of VP you can pick, right? There's younger person who's the future, right? And then there's older person who's like the sort of a party elder stabilizing presence. And the younger person who's the future pick, that was Paul Ryan. No, I'm saying in the past, right? Paul Ryan, Sarah Palin, and Kamala Harris herself. Whether like at the time that seemed like a bad pick for the future of the party. Now maybe it seems good. The vibes have shifted. We'll see how that goes. We'll judge Biden 2020 on picking Kamala retroactively, but that might have been actually a good idea in retrospect. But yeah, as for Walz connecting with the working class, I'm not. The American working class is very disunited, right? We don't have as strong of a working class, it's culturally united working class the way we did in like the 80s, right? In the 80s, you definitely had this fairly unified blue collar vibe sort of people who did end up going pretty strongly for Reagan, and that was one reason Reagan won so much. He was able to get the working class. Despite his reputation as the guy who only helps the rich, the Reagan Democrats were blue collar, a lot of like white ethnic types, sort of the equivalent of Hispanics, but for yesteryear. And Reagan was incredibly pro-Hispanic and pro-Mexican immigration because he thought that Mexicans would go the same way, as the white ethnics who supported him. But nowadays, it's a little different. You've got big gender breakdowns. So you see like working class women are actually pretty pro-democratic, but working class men are pretty pro-Republican. You see age, like a lot of the people we're calling working class are, older, like Gen X people who don't have college degrees, but who actually economically they're doing pretty okay. It's just that having a college degree wasn't as tightly connected to whether or not you economically succeed. You've got like a small business doing roofing, or your boat salespeople, or stuff like that, right? Car dealers. I don't know. So you could have in the old days, you could have economic success without a college degree more easily than you can now. I mean, you still can. You still see people who do, but it's a bit less common. It's more, correlated now. So for our generation, especially for the younger generation than for your generation, I guess, economically successful and college degree kind of mean the same thing, but for the older generation doesn't. So the work, and there's also racial breakdown. Like there's difference. Black, Hispanic, white, working class are all working class, but they're also kind of different. So there's gender, age, race, and stuff like that makes our working class a little bit more disunited than they were in 1980. And I think that's so the answer is I don't know, and I'm just sort of riffing here, but I'm not a political analyst, right? This is just I think he's fine. He seems good.
Speaking of returning to normalcy, and it's interesting because that typically we equate that with a Republican message, but we're talking about the Democrats. Similarly, you had this great post on sort of the weirdness discourse.
One more thing. Walz is the highest ranking soldier to ever serve in Congress.
Oh, really? Interesting.
He's a military guy. And so that's, that's again, like, military people who are in the working class, like enlisted people. That's like another breakdown. Like military people vote a little bit differently than others. But yeah, he is the highest ranking soldier to ever work.
It's interesting. Yeah, we'll find out how much people care about sort of like optics versus the like substance, because when someone appeals to both the professional class and the working class, perhaps they have the optics of one but the policies of another or something. And I've heard a couple people say that about Walz, that he's got sort of working class optics and while also appealing to more sort of professional class base in terms of actual policies. But we'll see. I'm curious about this weirdness discourse, or sort of this idea that Democrats can be the return to normalcy. It's an interesting strategy that seems to be working, at least on social media. There seems to be a lot of appeal to it. I liked your sort of hypothesis that it's sort of rubbing salt in the wounds of Republicans in terms of they used to be the main insider culture or the mainstream, and now they're the outsiders, sort of, Christianity, et cetera, on the outskirts. I've also heard other people just describe it as sort of, indicative that this is like a female versus male election, and sort of it's a very, feminine coded behavior to sort of call other people weird or creeps, or sort of, do sort of this kind of social policing or social curation, if you want to be more positive about it. But yeah, I'm curious how you make sense of it, and if you think it's a winning strategy.
Yeah. So I think for the weird thing means different things to Democrats and Republicans. The reason it's gotten so much under Republicans' skin is that a lot of Republicans are Gen X people who grew up feeling like I'm the normal guy, and like the blue-haired punk rockers, gay people or whoever, right? You're weird. I like nerds, you're a bunch of weirdos. And so that dynamic has really flipped, and it was primarily the internet that flipped it, and the rise of knowledge industries, right? You got now, like I said, now it's people with college degrees that make money. Like you could laugh at nerds in the 1980s, because you could say, like, I'm gonna, while you study and whatever, you're gonna be working in the basement of some company, while I'm gonna start my own company and be like a backslapping deal making business guy, right? And I'm gonna make the money, and then all of the money, and you'll just have your little, like, like Star Trek convention and shit. And like, but now, like if you're a nerd, you're gonna make the money, right? You're going to go into tech, you're going to go into finance, you're going to go into whatever, and you're going to make the money, while the guy who like peaked in high school, he's just left, he doesn't have as much money as you, and he's like a, angry 55-year-old guy writing just angry tweets, right? That's his life now. And, living out in bumfuck wherever, running like a sort of failing car dealership, who knows? But the point is, I may have taken that from Cobra Kai. But I guess the point is that the rise of knowledge industries flipped the script a lot, right? There was this moment when I was a kid when richest man in the world suddenly meant a bespectacled nerd who works with computers, and that was Bill Gates. That script flip, like think about yourself, right? Had you been born 15 years earlier, you would have been, your interest in technical stuff would have made you a a weirdo, a nerd. And now you feel comfortable feeling like a normal guy. Well, that changed. And it was knowledge industries changed it. And, of course, along with that went the clustering of knowledge industry workers into blue cities like San Francisco. And then the internet changed it too, right? Because all the, like, on the internet, it's, you can't just like get stuff the nerd in the trash can. The nerd can bully you, right? And unfortunately, most of the internet bullies are sort of like second string nerds who are into socialism. But that's they're the bullies now, trying to stuff people into the online trash cans. So the internet really flipped the script, and it allowed people. The internet also destroyed the hegemony of the old conservative culture, because now you don't have to meet people in your local area; you meet people online. So if you're living out in some conservative town in Nebraska, you can just be exposed to, you don't have to, like, your social circle won't be like the people at church, right? Your social circle will be people on the internet, and you get exposed to sex culture, to drug culture, to all these kind of things, right? And so, like, you're I don't know, you're watching OnlyFans. I don't know what normal people do. So, but the point is that the conservative hegemony really went away, and so the weirdness insult, I think, speaks to that. It really rubs salt in that wound. But to Democrats, I think it means something different. I think that when Democrats say weird, they're not trying to say, like, being a conservative is weird, because I think that implicitly they still think that a George Bush or Ronald Reagan style conservative would be normal to them in their mind. I think that the weirdness to them that they see in the Republicans has to do with the extremely online nature of Trump's movement specifically. Like, you have guy in like bullhorns and like a fur with face paint storming the Capitol Hill. Like, the fuck is that, man? And like, just so many weird stories are coming out about Republicans. Like, I don't know, Madison Cawthorn, like doing weird. He was even too weird for the Republicans. But like Matt Gaetz, with underage girls, like, and just all the stories with the underage girls, man. It's there's so many of those and they're all Republicans. Like, you have Democrats who do, like, still just have sex scandals, right? You still have like
RFK's got his own weirdness.
who?
RFK.
Well, he's not a Democrat. He's Republican.
Oh, isn't it? Yeah, he's a Republican running as Democrat.
Yeah, he's neither. He's just a like, he's just the anti-vax party. Who knows? He's the, like, get brainworms and like slaughter bears on the highway party. Who the fuck knows? The Kennedys have fallen very far. Anyway, but the point is, he takes more votes from Trump, so I think they're going to try to get him to drop out. And maybe they will, or maybe they won't. Maybe he'll spoil. Who knows? We can see. Anyway, but I think that's weird as fuck. And like the anti-vax stuff is so weird. It's like, vaccines fucking work. We give people vaccines for polio, for measles. Oh, but this vaccine actually causes a million things. And so, like, by the way, you'll notice among right-coded people and left-coded people, both of those people have lingering problems from the pandemic from inflammation, and both of those people have lingering problems from the pandemic from long-term anxiety. Right? Those two things cause long-term problems, right? Inflammation can cause all kinds of minor chronic health problems. If you get sick, you'll have stuff for like a couple of years sometimes. People just wouldn't notice that, or they wouldn't remark on it. It happens. But anxiety, long-term anxiety, is a big thing, and that'll cause all kinds of stuff. And so you'll notice that left-coded people call this long COVID, while right-coded people think that the vaccine did this to them. The left-coded people say COVID did this to them. The right-coded people say the vaccine did this to them.
We'll get back to the conversation in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Fast forward to the end of 2024. Think about your goals. What can you do right now to give yourself the best chance of succeeding? If learning a new language is on your list, you absolutely need to check out Babbel. Babbel offers a range of learning tools, self-study app lessons, live classes, and even podcasts, which have always been my favorite way to learn. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel isn't just a game to kill time and make you feel like you're learning a language. It's not overly academic or rigid either. It's all about learning language for the real world. Babbel stands out because it's designed by real people using a modern conversational teaching approach. It's not always easy, nothing worth doing ever is, but it's straightforward and designed to help you start speaking in just 3 weeks. With Babbel, I was able to brush up on my intermediate Spanish to ramp up for travel to Argentina last year, and was able to set clear goals based on how much time each week I wanted to practice. Join millions of Babbel language learners across all age groups. Here's a special limited time offer for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/econ102. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/econ102, spelled BABBEL.com/econ102. Rules and restrictions may apply. This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. If you're building a B2B SaaS app, at some point your customers will start asking for enterprise features like SAML authentication, SCIM provisioning, role-based access control, and audit trails. That's where WorkOS comes in, with easy-to-use and flexible APIs that help you ship enterprise features on day one without slowing down your core product development. Today, some of the hottest startups in the world are already powered by WorkOS, including ones you probably know, like Perplexity, Vercel, Jasper, and Webflow. WorkOS also provides a generous free tier of up to 1 million monthly active users for user management, making it the perfect authentication and authorization solution for growing companies. It comes standard with rich features like bot protection, MFA, roles and permissions, and more. If you are currently looking to build SSO for your first enterprise customer, you should consider using WorkOS. Integrate in minutes and start shipping enterprise plans today.
That's weird. And but also, I also think that there's a second meaning of weirdness for Democrats when Democrats criticize weirdness, which is that it's a tacit, implicit promise that they're going to be less weird. Because a lot of the woke stuff of the woke era was very weird. And there's still remnants of that weirdness. I mean, you see, white women for Kamala, right? And Richard Hanania, who himself is a weird dude, who I don't necessarily like, but occasionally he makes a good take. He started to make a few more good takes lately. So Hanania pointed out that the white women for Kamala seems like ultra woke stuff, but actually it was just people talking about how they can get out the vote, right? And there was one woman who spoke up and said, "Oh, white women shouldn't correct black people." So the 2010s era kind of shit, right? Saira Rao era bullshit. It was pretty rare. There was not much of that. It was it was primarily a celebration of, yay, white women, we're mobilizing, and so like they said it's okay to be white. That was the message of that, and he's right about that. The kind of weirdness we saw from the woke era is draining away. It's not gone yet. It's not 100% gone, but it's draining away. And a lot of the leftist stuff, the basically progressives just shut down the Palestine protest. The university administrators called the cops, and that was it. And nobody gave a fuck about the Palestine protesters, right? Like, Democrats made no concessions to them at all. Walz is like endorsed by AIPAC. He's like super like pro-Israel, by the way. And so that they're just like, they got rid of, so like ultra wokeness is like slowly draining away. And then the Palestine protesters were just like, okay, fuck you. Kamala is now, she's like coming out against federal job guarantee and single payer health care, and basically all of these like ideas that the Bernie left sort of bullied the Democratic leadership into saying they supported for a while, right? They're like, okay, you know what? We don't actually support that shit. And the left people are just like losing their minds, and no one cares because like they've beclowned themselves so hard. So I think that the Democrats, by calling Trump weird, the Democrats aren't going to say, we were weird, guys, I'm sorry. Like, that just doesn't happen. No political people do that. Like, Reagan didn't come out and say like, yes, Reagan was a crook, I'm sorry. Like, he didn't say that, but he did say stuff like, I will bring honor and respect to the presidency and uprightness. And he said that stuff. And that was like, he said it as an attack on Carter, but everyone understood this meant I'm not going to be like Nixon. And so I think that Reagan in some ways normalized the Republican Party after the Nixon years. Like, the Nixon reaction was kind of crazy. Like, Nixon was, saying if the president does it, it's not illegal, which is similar to what Trump has said. People didn't like that, but then, so Reagan normalized that. I think that Kamala wants to normalize the Democratic Party and make it not about the party of like ultra wokeness. That doesn't mean every woke thing is going to disappear. You're going to see another decade of culture war over trans stuff. That's happening. But the Democratic Party has basically said, okay, you know what? Actually, we like the cops. And Kamala is running on her record as a DA who, put a bunch of people in prison, and that's what made the left hate her in 2019, 2020, right? They're like, Kamala's a cop. Like, yeah, she is. So now you've got a cop and a military man running, right? You've got like a tough DA and like military dude running. And so like Democrats are moving away from their own weirdness of the 2010s. And so I think that, but they're not going to say like, I'm sorry, we were weird. They're going to say, you were weird. You Republicans were the weirdos, which is also true because everybody was kind of weird in the 2010s. The unrest of the 2010s broke everybody's brain. And now it's like, how do we put America back together and unbreak it? How do we unbreak brains?
Is it fair to say that Kamala's sort of inconsistency has helped her in that she can sort of shapeshift, like whatever policy she wants to have, she has something that can back it up in terms of her past that, sort of will give it credibility? Is that fair to say? There's a certain benefit to being a politician with longevity that also has had different positions over the years, as opposed to one sort of narrow, lane that if that lane is no longer popular, maybe like Bernie, for example,
Well, I think yes, maybe, because it depends on the politician. So Hillary Clinton executed a lot of changes, and it seemed opportunistic and shallow. Biden executed changes, and it seemed like him honestly changing his mind to people. And then, then John Kerry said, I was for the Iraq War before I was against it, and that was a disastrous thing to say. So, like, it depends on the politician. Right? It depends on how you've changed. I mean, I think Reagan started out with this reputation of being this fire-breathing, conservative reactionary guy, and ended up being this like, warm fatherly figure who just, loved immigrants and flags and barbecues and like, all this stuff. He changed over his, life too. And before that, he was a Democrat and a liberal and a union representative, right? Who just hung around with gay people and slept around in Hollywood. So he executed several changes over his life. So it just depends on who it is and can you pull it off convincingly. And I think that the truth about Kamala is that she was always a centrist who was tough on crime and who then opportunistically pivoted to wokeness in 2019, 2020 to try to ride that wave. And it failed because wokeness wasn't popular enough, even at its height, to get her in there. And she didn't do that convincing a job, right, of being the avatar of woke. And now she's switching back to sort of who she traditionally is, or I couldn't say really, because who knows who anyone really is, but she's switching back to her traditional thing. So after a sojourn in woke land, but Democrats, who among them did not, doesn't have a similar story, right? Who among them did not go woke in 2020?
Yeah, it's like buying crypto at the top, and
Woke
then,
is the left crypto.
yeah, exactly.
There's a line. I don't know if that's true, but it makes a good line.
But it's provocative. Let's go into some other sort of events that happened in the past week. So first off, a lot of people have been sort of panicking about the economy the other day, or market sentiment. I want to get a sense for what's happening in Japan, what's happening in the U.S. This is your area of expertise, although you're knowledgeable across many areas. But when you break down what's going on?
Oh, so basically, people were upset because stocks went down. They went down starting August 1st. There was a decline in U.S. stocks, and then over the weekend there was a big drop in U.S. stocks. But after the decline, the week-long decline, and then the drop, stocks were still up almost 10% for the year and 15% over the past 12 months. That's great, and that was before today's rebound, of course. That was at the nadir. It was still that okay, after the big weekend drop. And so 15% for a year is better than an average year. 9 point whatever percent for 7 months is better than your average 7 months. That's good. That's a good stock performance. That was after the drop. So really? You're freaking out over that? The freakout's already gone, by the way. The bounce came, now the freakout's gone. The bounce didn't totally cancel out the drop, but so we can talk about why that happened, but first we should talk about the fact that this isn't a thing to freak out about. It's stocks, bro. Stocks go up and down. That's why they're scary. That's why we have an equity premium. That's why people are scared to invest in stocks, because they don't like seeing their money go up and down every day. And if people got okay with seeing their money go up and down every day, if you had stocks where if people really just did the thing where they just put their money in an index fund and left it for 30 years, then we wouldn't see an equity premium anymore. In fact, yes, we wouldn't see equities outperform other asset classes as much anymore, because people would be okay with that risk, So yeah, so this is the world of stocks, man. But the point is that stocks performance over the year to date or past 12 months is still great. All right. So let's talk about the reasons that this actually happened. So one reason was because Japan's been having currency outflows, right? People are Japanese interest rates are low, interest rates in America are high, or wherever else are higher than Japan. So people were getting their money out of Japan. They were selling yen-denominated assets and buying assets denominated in dollars or other currencies like euros. And so that meant the yen was weakening and weakening and weakening, and Japanese people couldn't afford food and fuel and the other things they import, or even components to manufacture things. So it was a big problem, right? The yen was crashing. And so they had to do something. So one thing they did was they did currency intervention. They sold some of their foreign exchange reserves, but that's a temporary thing that you do to stop a panic. It's not a sustainable strategy, because eventually you run out of those if you keep doing that, right? You can't keep that up forever. So instead, what they have to do is raise rates. Two things will send the yen back higher, right? One is United States cutting rates, and the other is Japan raising rates. So Japan raised rates, right? And that meant, so raising rates helped stem the tide of currency depreciation. But first of all, raising rates makes stocks do badly. So Japanese stocks dropped a lot. Remember, when people raise rates, it's not just the 0.5% whatever increase today. It's the fact that it signals that now you're on a tightening cycle, right? And you're going to tighten more to come. And so anyway, the point being, if you see some of that, it's oh, we're in a tightening cycle now. And so that hurts stocks, right? Higher rates hurt stocks for a couple reasons. All right. Do you know the two reasons higher rates hurt stocks?
Because why do they hurt stocks? Let me think about it. So lower rates are good for stocks, higher rates are bad for. Why is that?
Why are high rates bad for stocks? There's two reasons. Yeah,
Because people save more, or
maybe. The two reasons are, number one, discount rate. So like you do a discounted cash flow model, you do valuation, right? High interest rate goes in the denominator. You raise the interest rate, and just the value of future cash flows goes down. And another way of thinking about that is like, okay, bonds pay more now. Why am I investing in these stocks? So that's the discount rate. The other reason is because higher interest rates over time will hurt aggregate demand, hurt the economy, and slow down profit growth. So there's the financial effect and the real effect of higher interest rates. So they're bad for stonks, and stonk people don't like higher rates. And so the most consistent thing that like equity, longs want is lower rates, and they'll come up with anything and any and every reason to support lower rates. Japan raised rates. It hurt stocks. It propped up the yen. Now that meant that propping up the yen, there were a bunch of people who'd bet on the yen to depreciate more. They said, okay, Japan's currency is crashing. They're not going to be able to reverse this. I'm going to bet on the yen crashing more. And this trade is called a carry trade. Basically, I won't go into the mechanics of how that works, but the point is that when these bets went bad, and people had borrowed money to make these bets, and when these bets go bad, and you'd borrowed money to do this, and suddenly the bets go bad, you've got to pay back. You've got to cover your losses, right? You got to cover your loans. You got to pay back the money that you borrowed in a short-term fashion to make this trade, this bet on the yen going down. So how do you get that cash? You need to raise cash really quick. How do you get it? Well, you sell your U.S. stocks, because that's a big liquid asset. It's easy to sell. You sell your U.S. stocks to cover your losses in the Japanese currency trade. Well, that meant U.S. stocks went down, and you sell your European stocks. European stocks went down. So that is one thing that made stocks go down. But I think that's not the number one thing. So let's talk about the economy. So the most people think that a recent bad economic data report was behind the stock decline in America. That is the most common explanation people give. Now, remember, stock journalism is bullshit, because nobody really knows what causes stocks to go down or up, right? So stock journalism bullshit. No one really knows any of this. They're just guessing, but they're like, oh, there was a bad economic report. All right. But overall, the economy, like that economic report actually wasn't very bad. Like people are just misreading it. All right. So do you want me to talk about the economic report?
Yeah, please.
Let's talk about that. So did you hear about this? Did you hear about bad economic numbers?
Only via your post.
Okay. Some people were talking about it. First of all, there were the payroll numbers. So, they have the survey, the government goes around and asks people like, hey, how many people you got on payroll? And they tell them numbers. And then the change in that from month to month is the payroll, is the jobs numbers. That's what that is. Okay. It's the change in how many people businesses say that they've got on payroll. And so that, has been going up by like 200,000 a month. This month it went up only by 114,000. Oh no! So people interpreted that as a sign of weakness. Also, unemployment rate rose to 4.3%. Now remember, we were at 3.7% a year ago. So now it's 4.3%. That's 0.6 percentage points higher, right? So that's higher. So it's creeping unemployment, and that triggered something called the SOM rule, which is if unemployment goes up by more than 0.5 percentage points, you're in a recession. Okay, we're not in a recession. The SOM rule it's just, that rule was made up from a small number of past data points with an arbitrary cutoff. It's not a thing you should really worry about a lot. It's just another way of saying unemployment, right? So the unemployment rate did go up, and the jobs numbers came in a little bit weak. But on the other hand, as everybody gets a job in the economy, your jobs numbers are not able to go up by as much. So you reach full employment, right? Your jobs can only increase at the rate of population increase instead of getting people back in the workforce who are out. Unemployment rose. But remember that unemployment is defined as the percentage of the labor force that doesn't have a job. People go in and out of the labor force. Okay. So what happened, labor force participation rose last month, which says that some people who previously said, I'm not looking for a job, I just don't have a job, but I'm not looking for one, started to say, you know what, I am looking for a job, and I don't have one yet. And that rose. And so labor force participation rose, meaning that the rise in unemployment came not from people getting kicked out of jobs, but from more people claiming to be looking for a job and not finding one, as opposed to just not looking for a job and sitting around at home. That's what happened. That's why the unemployment rate rose. If you look at the employment rate, the percentage of people who do have jobs, and if you restrict it to just prime age, so prime age workers 25 through 54, so that you don't get like retirements and school and all stuff like that, right? If you just look at prime age employment rate, that rose, and it rose to almost a record high. It rose to a high since the 90s and almost a record high. So that labor market indicator looks really good. And if you look at other economic indicators, they all look really good. So consumption looks really strong. GDP growth looks strong. Productivity growth looks really strong. Well, is strong for a developed country. It's growing at like 2 point something rather percent, right? It's decently strong productivity growth, good consumption, investment looks good. Basically everything except for this, this slight uptick in unemployment and slightly weak job numbers looks good. So like maybe there's a tiny bit of like economic weakness in there, but honestly, the economy still looks really good.
At what point would you say the debt is such a big issue that actually the economy is in like a unstable, or have we passed that point, or what would need to be true for you to be say, oh wow, I really worry about the
Well, I'm worried about the debt right now. We passed that a while ago. Like I am worried about it. It's not going to like kill us tomorrow, but it's a problem, right? Japan ran up this debt in the 90s and they're seeing big problems from it now with the currency outflows. Like, it's been 30 years. It took 30 years for debt to become a big problem for Japan, but it did. It eventually did. So debt is a long-term problem that we need to fix, right? We're going to have a decade to fix this. 2 decades, maybe. At least a decade to fix this, I think. So it's a problem, but it's not a problem today. And it's certainly not weighing on like GDP growth and all that stuff. And remember that strong economic growth does erode the debt, right? Inflation also erodes debt, but inflation's come back down. Inflation numbers look really good. Like we're back on track in terms of inflation. So the economic numbers look fine. I have a suspicion about what caused this stock price decline in America besides the Japan thing. I think that the Fed, people are wondering how hawkish the Fed is. How the Fed deals with an era of inflation that like the one we just had is still not something that people know. People know how they did in the 90s. People were very certain about how the Fed would deal with that. Now they're not. So the Fed waited too long. They waited till 2022 to start hiking rates. They should have done it in summer of 2021. They waited half a year too long to start hiking rates. And they know they fucked up, right? They know they messed up. The question is whether they'll err on the other side. So I think there's the possibility now that the Fed is now erring on being too hawkish. And they're waiting too long to start cutting. So I think that when the Fed on July 31st, which was last week, the Fed, some people thought they would cut, some people thought they wouldn't cut. They said, we're not cutting. The next day, stocks started falling. Because I think a lot of people decided the Fed was now more hawkish than they had expected. And that, I think, is what caused the stock price decline in America, in addition to the Japan thing. And I don't think the economic data was what did it. But people, well, I don't know. People might see the economic data, even though the economic data, they might think, okay, the Fed knew about this and they still decided not to cut. The Fed is being too hawkish. And so the economic data and the Fed action might have combined in people's minds to think like, oh gosh, we've got a super hawkish Fed. The Fed is going to leave interest rates at 5% for 5 more years, no matter what happens to the economy. And they're just going to, some people probably think that. The point is that I think that's why stocks went down a bit. Remember, stocks didn't go down like a ton, but I think that's why they went down a bit. Because remember, high interest rates, bad for stocks. And so also bad for bonds, even worse for high interest rates, make bond prices go down even more. So then, but yeah, high interest rates, bad for stocks. And so I think that now what you see now is people expect the Fed to cut in September. And so I think this would be a good idea for the Fed to do this, because if they don't, they could dash expectations, cause more stock price declines, but most importantly, they could cause some more unemployment. They could cause unnecessary hurt to the economy by failing to fulfill people's expectations of rate cuts. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. I'm curious that what just happened to Japan, doesn't happen in more countries as we raise rates or lower rates. Have you heard of this guy Brent Johnson has this theory called the dollar milkshake theory, which basically says something like, I'm going to botch it, but this idea that no matter what happens to the U.S. economy, so first, what happens to the U.S. economy, greatly influences what happens to every other economy that is denominated in dollars or has a lot of dollars, and in a world in which the U.S. economy starts to have great difficulty, all the liquidity will come to the United States, or like basically the United States will be the last economy standing, no matter what happens.
Could happen, yeah. So that's this is a problem for the United States, honestly, because first of all, it hurts our manufacturing industries, but also it makes us complacent. It's like it's a bit of a resource curse, It's like we don't have to be as fiscally responsible because we will be the last economy standing. But yet, I think that we'll be the last economy standing, but that doesn't mean we'll stand forever, right? Interest costs are going up for the government, and the government has to pay those. We're not going to default, right? We have to pay those. And that is going to crowd out other budget priorities, right? We're not, we can't just borrow to pay that interest and then borrow more to pay the interest on that and then borrow more. Like that just explodes and then your country goes into hyperinflation. So we can't do that. We can't, we've got to crowd out other stuff, right? That's bad. We don't like that. And so, of course, interest rates aren't going back to zero. And so we're not going to get, the low, like if interest rates go back to like 3%, 2.5%, whatever, right? That will help the debt situation. That will help the interest cost. And everyone expects this to sort of happen. That will help, but it won't solve the problem. And we're going to need to do fiscal austerity. And that's going to be painful and no one's going to have fun with that. But it's what is going to have to be done. And so hopefully the parties can be responsible enough to do this in a bipartisan way.
Yeah. Speaking of economies that are not doing that well, I want to segue to Venezuela. You wrote this great post that basically just detailed how did Venezuela get here? What did Chavez do wrong? What were the major mistakes over the past decade plus that have led Venezuela to be in the situation that it is today?
So Venezuela, first of all, Venezuela is heavily oil dependent and has been for a long time. It's a petrostate. And in the 1970s, Venezuela nationalized their oil company, like many other countries did. And they created a state-owned oil company called PDVSA, which stands for a long thing in Spanish. But PDVSA was very well run. It had high state capacity. All the best and the brightest Venezuelans, and even some high-skilled immigrants from Argentina, like my aunt, went to work for PDVSA. And they did really well. So they actually were more efficient than most state-owned oil companies in the world. Like they were more efficient than like Mexico's state-owned oil company. They were very good at what they did. Right. And they invested a lot of money, and the government basically stood back and said, here's money to invest, go invest, increase our oil stuff. It was the goose that laid the golden eggs for Venezuela, PDVSA. Chavez came in the early 2000s, or in, I guess, late 90s, but he really started doing this in the early 2000s. He's like, okay, I want to do two things. I want to give money to poor people to fulfill my populist promises. And I want to give money to cronies to fulfill my personal commitments to my cronies. He did both of these in, about half and half, I guess. And so where do you get the money? Well, you can tax rich people, but Venezuela is not very good at taxing stuff. And they already had pretty high taxes. Instead, he raided the investment budget of PDVSA. PDVSA was putting all these billions of dollars toward investing in new oil production. Now, Venezuela has to invest a lot of money for its oil production because Venezuela's oil is shitty. It's not like Saudi Arabia or Iran or even America. It is very heavy stuff and it's sour. So it's very hard to get out. It doesn't just like jump into your wells and gush. It doesn't do that. You have to like, come here. It's like full of crap. And then you have to refine it because it's got all this sulfur and you have to mix it with like light oil and you have to do all this stuff. It's hard. It's a lot. It's not Saudi Arabia, which has light, sweet crude. You can drink it in a milkshake. No, don't do that. So Venezuela always had to invest a shit ton of money to get this oil out. They didn't have a big cushion. Chavez didn't understand that. And his people were dumb. Like Chavez was just like a legit dumb person. And his people didn't understand this. So they raided this investment budget. And then the PDVSA people, all these like competent technocrats, all the really competent people in the country got really mad that their budget was being raided because they knew this was going to fuck up oil production. So they went on strike. They had a gigantic strike. And tens of thousands of people struck, right? And Chavez fired them. He fired 19,000 PDVSA workers. 19,000. How many air traffic controllers did Reagan fire? I guess like a few hundred, I think. I don't remember. They fired 19,000 workers from the most, of the most competent people doing the most important thing that Venezuela depends on for its lifeblood. And he just appointed all kinds of cronies and idiots in their place. What did they do? What happened? What happens when you raid a place's, when you raid the oil company's investment budget in a place with oil that's incredibly investment intensive, and then you fire all the competent people and replace them with idiots? What happens? Oil production gets fucked. And so oil production started falling, but Venezuela got bailed out by luck because there was a massive, massive spike in oil prices. So oil revenues kept coming in for a few years during that massive oil price spike.
And why was the spike?
Why was the oil price spike? A lot of it was China. Chinese demand spiked oil, and the Saudis and other oil fracking hadn't really come online much yet in America. And the Saudis other people had not anticipated that Chinese demand would be so high. This is back in the 2000s, right? This is a while ago. And there were other reasons too, but I think those are the main reasons. Basically, oil, once you have demand, like oil after a certain point is very inelastic. So like if you have demand that increases past a certain point, like prices will just shoot up because the fields are pumping as much as they can, and it'll take them like years to pump more. So as soon as the price spikes, everybody just opens up new wells, and then the price crashes, right? That's why oil is very volatile. The supply response is very effective, but it takes a couple of years. So Venezuela had a few years of high oil prices. I don't remember how, like 3 years maybe, of high oil prices to cushion this blow, and just money was flowing into government coffers from their existing oil production, while their future oil production was getting fucked, and they didn't realize it. And then Chavez died. He went out at the top. He called the top with his death, and then Maduro, his trusted lieutenant, came in, took over, and by this point, Venezuela was pretty much a dictatorship. It had shifted from a democracy to pretty much a dictatorship during Chavez. So then, due to the destruction of the state-owned oil company, they really got screwed, and oil prices went down. All the chickens came home to roost, and the goose that laid the golden eggs was now dead, and other poultry metaphors for they're fucked. That was one of three bad things that Chavez and Maduro did. The second thing was that Chavez started nationalizing companies left and right, and Maduro continued this trend. In many left-leaning governments will nationalize telecoms, they'll nationalize railroads, they'll nationalize sometimes banks. But they'll especially banks are always kind of quasi-nationalized anyway, but they'll nationalize telecoms and transport and energy. They'll nationalize energy. Mining, like most mining stuff. Like they'll nationalize that stuff. Chavez started nationalizing things like supermarkets, manufacturing, housing, things like that, like things that normally don't do very well when you nationalize them at all. Like nothing does incredibly well when you nationalize it. A few things do, like utilities actually do well when you nationalize them, but a lot of things don't do well when you nationalize them. But some things do okay, like telecoms. Like honestly, your state-owned telecoms do okay, right? They're a little bit worse than AT&T, but they're not like a lot worse, right? Because telecom's kind of a natural monopoly. So anyway, but you nationalize supermarkets, you're fucked. You nationalize like housing, you're fucked. All these things, nationalizing things is really bad news. And so Chavez started doing this, and he also did it in an arbitrary way. When a business, there were businessmen he didn't like, or there's cronies didn't like, he'd just take their business. And of course, you pay them money when you take the business, you buy the business from them, but you get to set the price, right? So you're going to pay them a much cheaper price than they would otherwise have gotten on the market for their business. You expropriate stuff basically, and you nationalize it, and you put your cronies in charge. So this is obviously super damaging to an economy. And so everyone started trying to get their money out of Venezuela. Well, what happens when everyone tries to get their money out of a country? What happens to the currency?
It becomes weaker.
Yes, it becomes weaker because everyone's selling it. And so demand goes down. So you're just like everyone's selling the bolivar, Venezuelan bolivar. And so because they're trying to get their money out of Venezuela.
So then you have massive inflation, or?
Well, yes, you had massive inflation. So hyperinflation began, in about 6 months before Chavez died, and then began under Maduro to really ramp up. And then you also had currency crash, so you couldn't afford a lot of these imports because Venezuela didn't invest in their light oil production. They were just investing in the heavy oil stuff. Because they didn't invest in keeping up light oil production, they ended up having to import all this light oil to mix with their heavy oil. And so actually net oil imports collapsed long before total oil imports went down. or total oil exports went down, but net exports collapsed because they had to import a bunch of oil in addition to exporting oil. So that sucked. It didn't collapse. It just went way down, and then later it collapsed. So then hyperinflation was triggered, and so this sucked. Now, how did Chavez and then later Maduro respond to rising prices? Do you think that they did like, fiscal austerity? No. They did price controls, and they did price controls on any number of things. And they said, if you violate these price controls, we'll send the army after you, we'll send the police after you, we'll kill you and your family. And if we find you raising prices, that put a ton of businesses out of business, and they just moved their money out of the country, exacerbating the currency crisis and exacerbating hyperinflation. Big fucking spiral there. And so those three things really screw. So destruction of the state-owned oil company, expropriation of business, and price controls. That was how Venezuela destroyed itself, and Maduro made all those things worse.
Now let's go to the opposite and talk about how countries got rich. You briefly wrote about how there's a debate about how East Asian countries got so successful. Why don't you unpack the couple different cases there? You mentioned Basil's post.
Oh yeah, so right. There's this long running debate of countries of basically productivity, the relative importance of productivity catch up versus capital investment. Capital investment means basically you tell the financial system, lend money cheaply to anyone who wants to build stuff. Right? So so basically you raise your savings rate, and then you lend out all that money to businesses who want to buy machinery, to businesses who want to build housing, to people who want to build, governments that want to build roads. You just lend money to invest. You buy machineries and factories and chips and cars to transport your stuff, and then you buy like offices, and you buy housing, and you buy roads and ports and blah blah blah. So you just build. That's capital investment, right? The productivity catch-up is a little bit different. Productivity catch-up is like, okay, we don't actually know how to build complex stuff. No one in this country knows how to make a microchip, so let's figure it out. No one in this country knows how to make a car engine, so let's figure it out. How do you do it? Well, you do it a number of different ways. One is you license technologies from overseas. You buy patented stuff. Another is you steal it. You just send guys out to steal it. Another is you reverse engineer it. So you grab your machine and you pull it apart, and you're like, whoa, so that's how it works. Let's do it that way, So you reverse engineer, you steal, you license. And then the fourth way is you hire people who know how to do this stuff. So famously, when Korea wanted to build up its car industry, it hired guys that the Japanese car industry forced into early retirement at 60. These guys had nothing to do. And so they were just like, Korea's like, hey, come on over to Korea. We got everything you need. We got hot people, cheap housing, whatever that's what we got. And so then the old Japanese guys are like, okay.
Like the pickup artist for last week that we spoke about.
Well, I don't know about that guy. But these are like 60-year-old guys, but they were like really good car engineers and some like electronics engineers from Sony and Panasonic, whatever, went to help Samsung and LG get their start. And so that's why all the Korean products look just like the Japanese stuff, because it's the same guys, right? So they absorbed foreign technology, and they did a lot of other stuff too. Japan absorbed foreign technology from America by getting people to work in Japan, but also by licensing, by reverse engineering. Japan didn't actually steal very much. They're pretty up and up, but China stole a shit ton, right? America stole. We stole from England. We're a bunch of thieves. Basically, whatever America did to Europe, like China did to America, whatever America did 100 years ago, China does now. Like China is just America of 100 years ago with a communist flag, but it's just America 100 years ago. So in many ways, and economically, right, and some ways culturally as well. So
how so culturally?
Culturally? Well, I mean, Chinese people just they sit around watching TV, like shitty TV. They put on Crocs and shorts. They drive to the mall. That's what they do for fun. It's drive to the mall, right? They all have big unrealistic dreams of I'm going to get rich someday. I just don't know how, right? They work hard, but they cut corners. They're all working really hard to support their one deadbeat cousin or their deadbeat uncle or something that and they love housing. They're obsessed with housing.
Are they too going to have a hippie / woke era? Do you think that?
I mean, they have the lying flat people that's recognizably the slackers, right? You that's their Gen X slackers, is the lying flat people. Hippies, I don't know, but consumerism, certainly, if you view hippies as sort of consumerism. China's very harsh on drugs, so maybe it won't manifest exactly the same. But in terms of sexual revolution, absolutely. Like basically at some point, according to all reports, I don't know, but according to all reports, China had a sexual revolution as well, starting in the sort of late 2000s. And, so they did have, in that sense, yes, they absolutely did. Woke will come later. Woke is more of an America-specific thing, but China will have stuff sort of like that. Now they're in their sort of Jim Crow era with the way they treat like the Uyghur population and other minorities. And yeah, so but in many ways culturally they're very similar to us, and probably the reason is there's two reasons for that. One is that is big, right? They're a big country, we're a big country too. But another reason is that we don't have an ancestral culture because we just imported people from everywhere. And like you can't look at British culture, for example, and say like that's really our culture, right? Like Britain is weird to us. They're different. We don't really have an ancestral culture so much because we're all from all over the place. China had a very long, rich ancestral culture, but the communists just forcibly destroyed it. They concertedly destroyed every bit of classic culture. So in some ways, both these cultures start from zero, not 100% from zero, but sort of start from zero, and try to use capitalism and consumerism as a substitute to fill the hole of tradition. Whereas, cultures like Japan, Korea, or European countries, they're still more continuous with their old culture, right? With their old architecture, with their old, festivals, with their old, religions. All this old stuff is still there in those countries. And it's, us, we invented new stuff. We invented Mormonism and Scientology and like Reform Judaism, right? We invented all this stuff. And then but then really our real religion is just like Taylor Swift. And so I think that China is in a similar place in this. But institutionally they're more similar to what we were 100 years. Yeah. Anyway, but so the question, there's this debate. How do countries get rich? Is investment more important or is productivity gains more important? And so the problem is these two things are correlated. Because first of all, when you do productivity gain, when you have productivity gains, that spurs investment. Because now we know how to make a car engine, so that's going to spur investment in car factories, right? One causes the other. Also, when you invest stuff, you're buying machinery that upgrades your productivity. So no one really knows. There's an interplay between these two, so no one really knows how to break these down. So they argue back and forth, but there's very little definitive answer. I think earlier in the 90s, opinion swung more toward the idea of like just invest, whereas now opinion swinging more toward the okay, you actually need importing foreign technology is actually much more important than just brute force investment. So big debate here. With China, what's interesting is that they seem to have switched which one they're relying on. So before 2008, China's productivity growth was great. It was similar to Japan, Korea, all this stuff. They were learning how to do all this stuff. And their economy was very based on exports, it was very based on foreign investment, right? Foreign people came over and taught Chinese people how to do things. They licensed stuff. They did joint ventures. They stole things. They did any way they could. They absorbed foreign technology, and it was very effective. Their productivity rate was growing at 3% a year. That's great. Their total factor productivity, not labor productivity. Their total factor productivity going at 3% a year. Developed country grows at 1% a year. So they were catching up in a big way. Then 2008 happens and it all comes crashing down, and productivity growth drops to like 0.8% a year, which is actually slower than a lot of developed countries. But they keep investing. They keep building capital. They build especially housing, infrastructure, offices, factories, more. But their productivity isn't growing like it used to. There's been a big productivity slowdown in China. And it slowed down earlier than it did for other Asian countries. And I mean at a lower level of development. Why? Well, we don't know. Part of it is just because they shifted a lot of their investment from manufacturing to real estate, and Xi Jinping's trying to shift it back. But also, the foreign direct investment started getting cut off. That's accelerating now. So it was harder to absorb foreign technology. And, the state started interfering more, especially under Xi Jinping. That accelerated. So that, capital began to flow back towards state-owned enterprises. And so the interference from the state probably had something to do with this too. So basically, it's not clear whether Xi Jinping hopes that he will be able to bring back the productivity growth of the 2000s and 1990s and 1980s, right? that was prevalent under Deng, Zhang, and Hu. He hopes that shifting investment away from real estate back toward manufacturing will resuscitate productivity growth. But that remains to be seen.
Got it. Is maybe just closing on this, is China's growth basically the one outlier success by a country that is not sort of liberal or democratic, that sort of somewhat questions that you have to be liberal and democratic to grow in a significant way?
Yes and no. I mean, so like, the real one that questioned it was Singapore, right? I mean, it's a tiny country, so it's maybe easier to grow as a city state, but it did all the right things, and it's richer than America. And yeah, Singapore, they're somewhat democratic, but they, like, at least in the 60s, 70s, they were pretty autocratic, and they slowly shifted in the direction of democracy. And I wouldn't call them a full democracy yet, but they're sort of like halfway there, I'd say, or more. And that they've grown really rich, and with a long ruling one party state, and a lot of restrictions on things like media, speech, things like that. Who's a democracy and who's not? It has a lot of moving parts and has a lot of opinions. But I will say that, so Singapore really calls into question. China is still at 1/4 America's per capita GDP, right? Maybe more than a quarter, maybe almost a third now. But yeah, but they're still not nearly as rich as us. And they're not even as rich as other countries like, Europe, Japan, Korea. They're not as rich as those either. We'll see where they get. Like, the jury's still out. Yes, China grew successfully, and yes, it has its companies have mastered many technologies, but it's still overall not as rich as some of these places. So we'll see whether that makes a big difference. We'll see whether that becomes decisive. So I would say we just don't know yet. And certainly this has called the efficacy of democracy into question in a lot of people's minds. But whether it's called the efficacy of democracy into question in reality will take longer to know. So, I mean, I'll say that under Xi Jinping, who's definitely more of a dictator, he's more statist. He's a real dictator. Like, Deng Xiaoping was a dictator briefly. Zhang and Hu were not really dictators. They were like first among equals of an oligarchic one-party state. But Xi Jinping's a bona fide dictator, and he has shifted capital back in the direction of state-owned enterprises. He has meddled a lot more in the economy. He has done a lot of highly questionable stuff. He's seen a giant growth slowdown on his watch. So I would, depending on, maybe he can pull it out with this big manufacturing push. Maybe he can turn things around. But if you ended his tenure now, you'd say, no, dictatorship, bad.
I think one other critique of China early on was, hey, it can't innovate, it can only copy, but that narrative.
That was always bullshit. That's just, when you're a poor country, you import technology. When you're a rich country, you invent technology. Same thing everywhere. They're like, China can't innovate. Just shut up. Yes, they can. Like, it's not always good at everything. Like China notably failed to build good jet engines, as did Japan, actually. They failed to innovate. They innovated some, but they didn't get all the way there. China did okay in chips, but even before the export controls, they were still pretty behind in chips, top-end chips. Robotics, they bought some German people, and they do good low-end robotics, but the high-end stuff, they're not. There were areas where China wasn't as good, but there are areas where they're just absolutely the best. So electric vehicles, motors, batteries, drones, and a lot of this other stuff. China just kicks everyone's ass in the world leading in all the electric industries. China is the electric nation. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great, we're over time, but this has been a great overview of the U.S. economy, Venezuela, China, Walz. We covered some great ground here. Listeners, do submit questions. We'll do a mailbag episode very soon. And Noah, as always, great conversation. Until next time.
Until next time.